What if the woman sitting in the dirt outside your wedding was not a beggar at all? What if she was the most powerful person in the room, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting? And what if the secret she was carrying was not about money, not about pride, but about a murder that happened 20 years ago, a murder that your wedding was about to finally expose? This is not a simple story about a rich mother testing her son's bride. This is the story of a woman who spent 2 decades hunting a truth that everyone else had buried. A mother who dressed in rags not out of desperation, but out of strategy. And a wedding that was never just a wedding. Sit down. Because what happens at this ceremony will shake something loose in your chest that you will not be able to put back. Mama Adaeze was the kind of woman that buildings respected. Not people. Buildings. The structures she had raised from bare ground across 4 states, hospitals, clinics, maternal wards in towns that had never seen a doctor, they stood the way she stood. Straight. Unmovable. Built to outlast everything that tried to bring them down. She was 61 years old. Her hair had gone fully silver before she turned 50, and she had never once considered coloring it. Silver was earned. Silver meant she had survived things that should have killed her. She wore it like a crown she had not asked for but would not remove. If you passed her on the street today, not in her office, not in the boardroom where investors straightened their ties when she entered, you might not look twice. She still bought her wrapper fabric from the same market woman she had known for 30 years. She still cooked her own soup on Sunday mornings. She still sat in the same wooden chair her late husband Chitty had carried up 3 flights of stairs the week they moved into their first real apartment, laughing the whole way up because the chair was too wide for the staircase and he refused to admit it. Chitty. Even thinking his name still did something to her breathing. He had been gone for 20 years. And not one day of those 20 years had Mama Adaeze believed what the police report said. Car accident. Wet road. No witnesses. Case closed in 11 days. 11 days. For a man who had built a hospital foundation from the ground up. For a man who had told her 3 weeks before his death that he had found something in the foundation's accounts that he could not explain, something that meant someone he trusted had been stealing, had been lying, had been building a second life on money meant for sick children in villages that had no other hope. He had told her he was going to the authorities. He had told her to stay quiet until he did. 3 weeks later, he was dead. And the accounts were clean. Whatever he had found was gone. And the foundation continued. And life continued. And everyone told Mama Adaeze that grief made people see things that were not there, that Chitty's death was a tragedy but not a conspiracy, that she needed to heal and move forward for her son's sake. Her son, Emeka, who was 5 years old when his father died and who grew up with his mother's grief as a permanent piece of furniture in their home, something always present, something he learned to move around without touching. Emeka was 34 now. He was a good man. Mama Adaeze knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, without having to check. He had his father's forehead and her eyes and the particular kind of patience that only comes from watching someone you love carry pain they never fully put down. He had taken over the management of the foundation at 28 and tripled its reach in 6 years. He was quiet in meetings and loud at the dinner table, and he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, which was his father's exact habit, and which still occasionally made Mama Adaeze have to look away. He was going to be married in 3 days. Her name was Vivian Okafor, 29 years old. Lagos family. Her father, Chief Okafor, ran a private equity firm that had fingers in more industries than most people could name. Vivian was elegant in the way that takes years of deliberate practice, the kind of elegant that does not slip, that does not wrinkle, that does not reveal anything it has not chosen to reveal. She had been with Emeka for 2 years before the engagement and 14 months engaged, and in all that time, Mama Adaeze had watched her the way she watched everything she did not yet understand. Carefully. From a distance. Without conclusion. She did not dislike Vivian. That was the honest truth. She simply did not know her. And in Mama Adaeze's experience, the most dangerous people in the world were not the ones you disliked. They were the ones you could not read. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months before the wedding. No stamp. No return address. Slipped under the front gate of her compound sometime before the guards changed shift at 5 in the morning. Her housekeeper found it and brought it to her at breakfast, confused, because the envelope had only one thing written on the front. Mama Adaeze. Personal. She had opened it slowly, the way she opened everything she did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of plain white paper. One paragraph. Typed, not handwritten. She read it once. Then she set down her tea. Then she read it again. The woman your son is marrying knows what happened to your husband. She has been looking for something in your family for 2 years. The person who killed Chidi Okonkwo will be standing inside the wedding venue on that day. If you want the truth, do not come as who you are. Come as someone no one will watch. The invisible ones always see the most. Mama Adaeze sat with that letter for 4 hours. She did not call the police. She had not trusted the police since they closed her husband's case in 11 days. She did not call her lawyer. She did not call her closest friend. She sat in Chidi's chair. She had moved it to her study years ago, and she thought. The letter could be false. Someone playing a cruel game with a grieving woman. She had considered that. But something in her chest, something that had been quietly vibrating for 20 years like a string pulled too tight, went very still when she read it. The stillness of recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. She had always known the truth was coming. She had simply not known when, or from which direction. The next morning she called her most trusted aide, a woman named Emeka who had worked beside her for 15 years and who had the rare quality of being completely unshockable. She told Emeka only what she needed to know. She needed old clothes. Not costume old. Real old. The kind of old that meant nothing and no one. A wrapper that had seen too many washes. Sandals that had given up. A headscarf that swallowed the face. A bag that looked like it had been rescued from a roadside. Emeka had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, very quietly, "Yes, Ma." And she had not asked a single question. The 3 months between the letter and the wedding, Mama Adaeze had used carefully. She had pulled every thread she could find on Vivian's family without alerting anyone that she was pulling. She had gone back through 20-year-old financial records from the foundation, documents she had kept in a locked cabinet in her study that no one else had ever opened. She had looked at names, at dates, at amounts, and she had found something she had missed before. Or perhaps she had not missed it. Perhaps she had simply not been ready to see it. The foundation had 3 co-founders. Chidi, a man named Eze Madu, who had died of a stroke 8 years ago, and Chidi's younger brother, Uncle Chukwu. Uncle Chukwu, who still came to every family gathering, who still hugged her first when he arrived and last when he left, who had cried the longest at Chidi's funeral, who called Emeka his son and meant it with such apparent warmth that no one had ever once thought to look at him sideways. Mama Adaeze looked at the numbers in those old records and she did not yet have proof. But she had the stillness again. The recognition. She was still looking when the wedding week arrived. Still without proof. Still without a name she could take to anyone. Only a letter, and old records, and 20 years of a string pulled too tight. And so on the morning of the wedding, before the sun had properly decided to rise, Mama Adaeze dressed herself in the clothes Emeka had prepared. She looked in the mirror for a long time. Then she picked up her old bag, the one with a small hidden pocket sewn into the lining 3 months ago at her private instruction, and inside that pocket was her phone, fully charged, and a small recording device no larger than a button. She walked out of her compound through the back gate while the guards were still at the front. She found her way to the venue the long way, through the back roads, arriving 2 hours before the first guests. She sat down in the dust near the entrance. She arranged her wrapper. She adjusted her headscarf. She placed a small tin on the ground in front of her. And she became invisible. The wedding had not yet started. But Mama Adaeze was already watching. And in 20 years of searching, she had learned one thing above everything else. The truth never hides forever. It only waits for someone patient enough to sit still and let it come to them. She was the most patient woman in the room. Even if the room was a dusty courtyard and no one in it knew she was there. The first guests arrived at 9:30. They came the way wealthy people arrive at weddings, not all at once, but in careful waves, each group dressed to remind the previous group that they had made an effort. Long convoys of polished cars. Women in Gelly that added 6 inches to their height and required a second person to tie correctly. Men in Agbada that moved like architecture when they walked. Perfume that reached the entrance before the person wearing it. Mama Adaeze watched all of it from the dust. She had chosen her position carefully. She was sitting to the left of the main entrance, close enough to see every face that passed through, far enough to be dismissed without effort. There was a low concrete block beside the gate post, and she had settled against it with the particular stillness of someone who had nowhere else to be. Her wrapper was the color of dry earth. Her headscarf sat low on her forehead. Her sandals were the kind that made no sound. She had even rubbed a little dust across the backs of her hands because her hands, after 61 years of work, were still too strong, too purposeful, and she did not want anyone looking at her hands. The tin sat in front of her. Empty. Guests passed. Some stepped around her without looking down. One woman gathered her wrapper slightly to one side as she passed, the automatic gesture of someone protecting good fabric from imagined contamination. A group of young men laughed loudly at something on a phone and nearly walked over her tin before one of them caught it with his foot and kicked it slightly to the side without stopping or apologizing. Mama Adaeze watched all of them. She was not watching for cruelty. She was not there to conduct a test of kindness. She was watching for something specific. A look. A signal. The particular way that people who share a secret communicate across a crowded room without words. She had learned to read that language a long time ago. Uncle Chukwu arrived at 10:15. She recognized him before she could stop herself from reacting, and she caught the reaction in her own chest and held it down, pressed it flat, kept her eyes at the level of passing feet. He was 63 now. He had always been the better-dressed brother, the one who wore his clothes like he had been born into them. Today he wore a cream and gold agbada with a walking stick he had recently adopted, not because he needed it, she suspected, but because it gave him something to do with his hands at social events. He was laughing before he even reached the gate, already performing warmth for an audience that had not yet fully assembled. She watched his feet as he passed. Then, when she was certain he had moved far enough inside, she raised her eyes and tracked him through the entrance. He greeted people the way he always did, loudly, with both hands, his laughter arriving half a second before it was warranted. He kissed the cheeks of women who were too flattered by the attention to notice it was automatic. He slapped the shoulders of men who immediately stood straighter. He was the kind of person who understood, instinctively and completely, that charm was simply management. That if you made people feel seen, they stopped looking at you carefully. Mama Adaeze had watched him do this at every family gathering for 20 years. She had always thought he was simply sociable. Now she watched the same behavior with different eyes, and it looked like something else entirely. It looked like maintenance. Like a man who was perpetually, carefully, making sure that no one in any room he occupied was ever fully paying attention. She pressed the small button on the recording device inside her bag. Then she returned her eyes to the gate. Vivian arrived at 10:45. She came in a separate car from Emeka, tradition, the bride not seen by the groom before the ceremony. Her bridal party surrounded her like a moving wall of color, 6 young women in matching copper-colored gowns who laughed and fussed and adjusted things that did not need adjusting. Vivian herself moved through all of it with a particular quality that Mama Adaeze had noticed the very first time she met her, the quality of someone who was present and absent simultaneously. She smiled at exactly the right moments. She touched her bridesmaid's arms with exactly the right amount of warmth. She was performing, but she was performing very well, and the performance was almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Almost. Mama Adaeze watched her face as she approached the entrance. Not her smile. Surprise. The eyes always did something the rest of the face did not get the message about quickly enough. And what Vivian's eyes did, in the half-second before she composed her expression into bridal radiance, was scan. Fast, practiced, sharp. She scanned the gate area the way someone scans a room they are not sure is safe. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the smile returned and she moved through the entrance and the bridesmaids fluttered around her and the moment was gone. But Mama Adaeze had seen it. Vivian was afraid of something. And she was looking for it. 10 minutes later, the incident happened. A young usher, distracted by something on his phone, failed to stop a group of late-arriving guests from pushing slightly toward the gate all at once, and in the small surge of bodies, someone's elbow caught the tin in front of Mama Adaeze and sent it skipping across the ground. The sound was small, but it was enough. 3 women nearby turned to look. They saw the tin. They saw her. Their faces did the thing faces do when they encounter something they have decided is beneath their concern. A quick assessment, a conclusion, a deliberate return of attention elsewhere. Then Vivian's chief bridesmaid, a tall woman named Sola whose copper gown fit like a threat, walked over. Not with kindness. With the energy of someone addressing a problem. You cannot sit here. This is a private event. You are blocking the entrance for guests. Mama Adaeze did not look up immediately. When she did, she kept her voice thin, the voice of an old woman who had been sitting in the sun too long. Please just... I am not troubling anyone. I only want to see my son married. Sola's expression shifted from inconvenience to something sharper. She turned her head and called toward the entrance. Vivian! Vivian, come and see this. Vivian walked back toward the gate. Her dress caught the morning light and the nearest guests turned to admire it. She reached the entrance and looked down at the woman sitting in the dust, and her face did something that Mama Adaeze catalogued and stored immediately. It was not disgust. It was not contempt. Those were the reactions she had prepared for. What crossed Vivian's face for exactly 1.5 seconds before she assembled her expression was something else. It was recognition. Not of Mama Adaeze specifically, she was certain of that. The disguise was complete. No, it was recognition of a type. The recognition of someone who has done something and who looks at a witness, any witness, and feels the walls of their secret tighten. Then it was gone. And what replaced it was cruelty, which was almost a relief because cruelty was something Mama Adaeze had prepared for. Get her away from this entrance, Vivian said. Her voice was low and controlled and absolutely cold. Today of all days, I will not have beggars sitting at my gate. This is embarrassing. Mama Adaeze looked up at her directly. Just for a moment. Just long enough to see whatever was behind the eyes before Vivian looked away. Please, she said again. My son is inside. I came a long way. Vivian did not respond. She had already turned. She spoke to Sola in a voice that was not quite low enough. Handle it. I have a wedding to prepare for. Sola stepped forward and her hand came down on Mama Adaeze's arm, and the grip was not gentle and the meaning of it was very clear. Mama Adaeze allowed herself to be guided several steps to the side, away from the direct entrance, repositioned like furniture that had been placed incorrectly. She sat back down. She arranged her wrapper. She replaced the tin. And then she waited. Because Vivian had recognized something when she looked at her, and that meant Vivian was carrying something, and people who carry things always have to put them down somewhere, always have to make contact with the place they have hidden the weight. And the wedding had not yet started and there were still hours ahead, and Mama Adaeze was the most patient woman in the courtyard. Emeka arrived at 11. She heard his voice before she saw him, that particular laugh, the one that started before the joke was finished, his father's exact laugh in his father's exact rhythm, and something moved in Mama Adaeze's chest that she had to breathe through carefully. He was wearing a navy suit with a coral pocket square that she knew without being told Vivian had chosen. He was shaking hands and receiving hugs, and his face had the particular expression of a man who is profoundly happy and slightly overwhelmed and trying to look like he is managing both. He was beautiful. He was his father's son. He had no idea what was sitting in the dust 30 feet from him. He walked past her without looking. She had known he would. She had prepared for it. She told herself it did not matter. It mattered. She pressed it down and kept her eyes open. The ceremony began at noon. The guests moved inside the large decorated tent and the courtyard emptied, and for a while Mama Adaeze sat alone in the settling dust with the distant sound of music and a pastor's amplified voice drifting through the tent walls. She did not go inside. She stayed where she was and she thought about what she had seen on Vivian's face. The recognition. The fear underneath the cruelty. The way her eyes had scanned the gate before she walked through it. Vivian was not simply an arrogant woman who despised the poor. That was real, but it was surface. Underneath it was a woman who had come to this wedding carrying the weight of something she needed to protect. Something she was afraid might surface today of all days. 40 minutes into the ceremony, the side exit of the tent opened quietly. A single figure slipped through it and moved along the far wall of the compound toward the back, away from the tent, away from the other guests. The figure wore a copper-colored gown. Not a bridesmaid. The gown was slightly different. The fit was slightly more expensive. It was Vivian. Mama Adaeze was on her feet before she had consciously decided to move. She moved along the opposite wall, using the trucks and catering vehicles parked at the side as cover, keeping her distance, keeping Vivian in her peripheral vision. Vivian reached the far corner of the compound where two large generators sat humming behind a zinc fence. She stopped. She looked back once toward the tent. Then she pulled out her phone. Mama Adaeze pressed herself against the nearest truck. She was close enough now. She confirmed the recording device was still running. Then she held completely still. Vivian's voice was low and tight, the voice of someone speaking through teeth they were trying to keep from clenching. I told you not to contact me today. I told you I would handle it after. The pause. She was listening. Because it is not that simple. She stopped. Something the person on the phone said made her jaw move. Her free hand came up and pressed against the side of her own face, the gesture of someone holding themselves together by the edges. I have been looking for 3 weeks. It is not in the house. It is not in his office. I think she moved it. Another pause, longer. Then Vivian said something that Mama Adaeze would spend the next hour turning over and over in her mind like a stone hiding something underneath. If she has the original documents, then everything our fathers built together dies today. And if that happens, I promise you, I am not going down alone. The call ended. Vivian stood with her phone pressed against her chest for several seconds. Then she straightened, smoothed her gown, and walked back toward the tent. Mama Adaeze stood motionless behind the truck. Our fathers built together. Her husband Chidi, Chief Okafor, Vivian's father, and one other. They had built the foundation together. 3 men. And when Chidi discovered the accounts had been touched, when he told Mama Adaeze he was going to the authorities, 3 weeks later he was gone. She had always thought the betrayal came from one of them. She had spent 20 years suspecting Ismadu, who was now dead, or Chief Okafor, who was still alive. But Vivian had said our fathers. Plural. And she had said she was not going down alone. Which meant Vivian knew what her father had done. And she had not come to this wedding to destroy the evidence. She had come to find something specific. Documents. Original documents. Something Chidi had prepared before he died. Evidence he had compiled before someone ensured he would never present it. Mama Adaeze's hand went to the bag at her side. To the locked cabinet in her study. To the files she had been through 100 times. There were documents in those files that she had never fully understood. A sealed envelope Chidi had pressed into her hands 2 days before his death, telling her to keep it somewhere safe and open it only if something happened to him. She had opened it in the weeks after his funeral, read it through tears that made the words swim, and then filed it away because at the time she had no one to take it to, no one she trusted, no one who would not tell her she was a grieving woman seeing things that were not there. She had never thrown it away. She had never moved it. Vivian was looking for that envelope. And Uncle Chukwu was inside the wedding tent right now, laughing his loud laugh, managing the room, making sure no one was watching him carefully. Mama Adaeze stood in the heat beside the humming generator and she understood something she had not fully understood when the morning began. This wedding was not just a ceremony. It was a deadline. Something was supposed to happen today. Something had been planned for today. And she was the only person in this compound who could see all the pieces from where she was standing. Because she was sitting in the dust. And no one watches the dust. She turned and walked back toward the entrance. She needed to be inside now. She needed to watch Uncle Chukwu. She needed to see who he spoke to and what he touched and when he moved toward the edges of the room. The ceremony was still proceeding when she slipped through the side entrance and found a position near the back, behind a pillar, in the shadow. The pastor was speaking about covenant and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Emeka stood at the front, facing Vivian, his face open and full and completely unprotected. The face of a man who trusted the woman in front of him completely. Vivian stood across from him, her expression composed into something that looked like love. She was a remarkable performer. But her right hand, hanging at her side, was pressed tightly against her thigh. The hand of someone keeping themselves from trembling. And Uncle Chukwu sat in the front row, 3 seats from the aisle, his walking stick resting across his knees. He was not watching the ceremony. He was watching the door. Mama Adaeze watched him watching the door. And she understood. He was waiting for something to arrive. Or someone. And he was running out of time. There are moments in life that look like stillness from the outside but are anything but still on the inside. A woman standing at the back of a wedding tent, half hidden by a pillar, watching a front row she was supposed to be sitting in. Watching her son promise his life to a woman who was hiding something. Watching her dead husband's brother check the door every 40 seconds with the patience of a man who has been waiting for something far longer than this afternoon. Mama Adaeze had spent 20 years learning how to be still while everything inside her moved. This was the longest she had ever had to hold it. The pastor was finishing the vows. His voice rolled through the tent with the particular warmth of a man who believed in what he was saying, and the guests leaned forward in their chairs with the particular warmth of people who had eaten well and wanted to cry at something beautiful. Emeka's voice, when he repeated the words, was steady and low and meant every syllable. Mama Adaeze could hear that from the back of the tent. She had always been able to hear the truth in his voice, even when he was 5 years old and trying to tell her he had not broken something he had broken. Vivian's voice was steady too. But it was the steadiness of control, not of peace. There was a difference. Most people could not hear it. Mama Adaeze heard it the way she heard everything she had trained herself to hear over 20 years of listening for things that other people had decided were not worth listening for. The rings were exchanged. The pastor smiled. The tent filled with applause. Uncle Chukwu clapped with everyone else. His eyes went to the door one more time. Then he reached into the pocket of his agbada and checked his phone beneath the level of the chair in front of him, the careful gesture of a man who had been doing things beneath the level of what other people could see for a very long time. Whatever he read on that phone made something change in his face. It was small. A tightening around the mouth. A stillness in the eyes that was not the stillness of peace. He put the phone away, picked up his walking stick, and rose from his seat while the applause was still covering the sound of movement. He moved toward the side exit. Mama Adaeze moved too. She kept the distance of 3 tent poles between them, moving along the far edge where the catering staff had left empty trays stacked against the canvas wall. No one looked at her. Old woman in a worn wrapper near the catering section was invisible the same way old women in worn wrappers were always invisible, completely, efficiently, by the agreement of everyone present. Uncle Chukwu slipped through the side exit into the compound. She followed 30 seconds behind. The afternoon's sun hit differently after the shade of the tent. She blinked once, oriented, found him. He was moving with more purpose than the walking stick suggested was necessary, crossing the compound toward the administrative block, a small office building attached to the venue that had been closed for the wedding, locked, a sign on the door saying staff only. He did not slow at the sign. He reached into his pocket, produced a key, and went inside. Mama Adaeze stood in the compound and looked at the door closing behind him and felt something cold and very final settle in her chest. He had a key. He had prepared a key to a locked room in the venue where his nephew was getting married. He had gotten here early enough to obtain or arrange that key. He had been watching the door during the ceremony, waiting for a message, and when the message came he had moved immediately. This was not opportunism. This was a plan. She crossed the compound, reached the door, and pressed herself flat against the wall beside it. Through the thin partition wall she could hear his voice, low, one-sided, another phone call. She is looking for the documents. He was saying, the wife. I told you she would be a problem but you said use her. Now she is inside the ceremony and I do not know what she told him. The pause. Listen to me carefully. If those original documents exist and someone finds them today, everything comes apart. Everything. Not just the old business. What we did after. All of it. What we did after. The cold thing in Mama Adaze's chest spread. What had they done after? After Chitty. After the accounts were wiped clean. After the case was closed in 11 days. What had they continued to do for 20 years, inside the foundation that her husband had built with his life and that she had continued to run in his memory, never knowing what was running underneath it? She pressed the recording device against the wall. You have 30 minutes. Chukwu's voice was flat now, stripped of all the warmth she had heard in the tent. Find the girl and tell her the deal has changed. She gets nothing if those documents surface. She knows what her father agreed to. She knows what silence costs. Tell her to remember what happened the last time someone in that family decided the cost was too high. Mama Adaeze closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. The last time someone in that family decided the cost was too high. Chidi, her husband, the man who had decided the cost was too high and had told her he was going to the authorities and had been dead 11 days later. Uncle Chukwu had just told someone to remind Vivian of that. Which meant Uncle Chukwu knew what had happened to Chidi was not an accident. Which meant he knew because he had arranged it. Which meant that the man who had stood at the graveside and wept the longest and called Emeka his son for 20 years and hugged Mama Adaeze first at every family gathering had been carrying this the entire time. She had suspected. She had looked at the numbers. She had felt the stillness of recognition when she thought his name. But hearing it spoken, even in this oblique and careful language, was different from suspecting. Hearing it spoken by his own voice in a locked room while her son sat in a wedding tent 30 meters away was a different thing entirely from suspicion. She became aware that her hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against the wall and held it there until it stopped. Then she turned and walked back toward the tent. Because she needed to see Vivian before Chukwu's message reached her. Because Vivian, whatever else she was a woman who had been told to stay silent by being reminded that the last person who spoke had ended up in the ground. And that changed everything Mama Adaeze had thought she understood about who Vivian was and what she had come here to do. She was 3 steps from the tent entrance when the tent flap opened from inside and Vivian came through it. They stopped. 2 feet apart. Face to face. Vivian looked at the old woman in the worn wrapper and something moved through her expression that was too fast and too complicated to be simple contempt. Something that looked, for just one unguarded moment, like the expression of someone who has been drowning quietly for a very long time and has just seen, without understanding why, something that might be solid ground. Then it was gone. Her eyes went flat. You again. Her voice was low and controlled. I thought I had you removed from the entrance. Mama Adaeze looked at her directly. She was done looking at her sideways. Sit down with me, she said. Her voice was not the thin voice of the old woman by the gate. It was the voice she used in boardrooms. The voice that buildings respected. Vivian blinked. I beg your pardon. I said sit down with me. Mama Adaeze gestured toward a pair of plastic chairs near the catering table at the edge of the compound. Away from the tent. Away from the other guests. Away from the administrative block where Uncle Chukwu was still on his phone making arrangements for the destruction of a young woman who was already being destroyed. I do not have time to sit with, Vivian began. Your father's name is Chief Okafor. Mama Adaeze said it quietly. He was one of 3 men who co-founded the Okonkwo Okafor Community Health Foundation in 2003. The other 2 were a man named Ismadu, who died 8 years ago, and a man named Chidi Okonkwo, who died 20 years ago in a car accident on a dry road on a clear night with no witnesses. Vivian went completely still. My name, Mama Adaeze continued, is not Grace. It is not whatever you have decided to call the old woman who was sitting by your gate this morning. My name is Adaeze Okonkwo. And Chidi was my husband. And the man you are marrying in that tent is my son. And I have been waiting 20 years for this conversation. So I am going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Sit down with me. The silence between them lasted 4 full seconds. Then Vivian sat down. They faced each other across the small plastic table. Around them, the compound was busy with catering staff and a photographer moving between the tent and the reception area. No one looked at the old woman and the bride sitting at the edge of things. No one ever looked at the edge of things. What do you want? Vivian said. Her voice had changed. The performance was gone. What was left was something stripped and exhausted and much younger than 29 years old. The truth, Mama Adaeze said. Starting with why you married my son. The question landed between them like something heavy. Vivian looked at her hands. Her wedding ring caught the light. Then she looked up, and what was in her eyes was not what Mama Adaeze had expected to see at any point in this day. It was grief. Real grief, the kind that has been living in the body so long it has changed the posture. I didn't know who he was, Vivian said. Not at first. I met Emeka at a conference. He was funny and kind, and he listened when I talked, and she stopped. She pressed her lips together. I fell in love with him before I knew his last name. Before I knew his mother's name. Before I understood what his family and my family meant. And when you found out? Vivian's jaw tightened. My father told me 3 months into the relationship. He told me what the Okonkwo name meant. What the old foundation history meant. He told me that Chidi Okonkwo had compiled evidence 20 years ago that could still destroy everything if it ever surfaced. And he told me that I was already close to the family, and that I should find out whether the evidence still existed and where it was kept. Mama Adaeze listened without moving. He did not tell me what really happened to Chidi. Vivian's voice had dropped to something barely above the ambient noise of the compound. He told me Chidi had died in an accident. He told me the evidence was dangerous to the family reputation. He told me to find it and destroy it. He made it sound like we were simply protecting a business legacy. Old financial irregularities. Things that could be misunderstood. But you found out differently. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I found my father's private records 8 months ago. She looked at Mama Adaeze directly. I found correspondence between him and Chukwu Okonkwo from the year Chidi died. Letters. Plans. I found the name of the man they paid. I found what they paid him to do. The air between them thickened. I have been trying to decide what to do with that information for 8 months, Vivian said. I love your son. I did not stop loving him when I found out what our fathers did. But I could not tell him without telling him everything. I could not tell him everything without destroying his family. Without destroying mine. Without opening a case that I did not know if anyone would believe after 20 years. Mama Adaeze looked at the young woman across the small table. She looked at the grief in her posture and the fear in her eyes and the wedding ring on her hand and the tent full of people 30 meters away and her son inside it waiting. She thought about 20 years. About the letter under her gate. About the recording device in her bag. About the man in the locked room with a key he should not have had, calling someone to threaten this woman with the memory of a death he had arranged. Then she reached into the hidden pocket of her bag and she placed something on the table between them. It was not large. A folded envelope, old, the paper slightly yellowed, sealed with tape that had been applied by someone who wanted it to stay sealed. Chidi's handwriting on the front. 2 words. For Adaeze. Vivian looked at it. Her breath caught. I have had this for 20 years, Mama Adaeze said. I read it once, in the weeks after he died, and I could not understand all of it. I understand all of it now. That is what my father was looking for. And Chukwu? He is in the administrative block right now. Mama Adaeze's voice was completely steady. On the phone. Arranging for someone to come and tell you that the deal has changed. That you get nothing if the documents surface. And he reminded the caller to tell you what happened the last time someone in your family decided the cost of silence was too high. The color left Vivian's face completely. He killed my husband, Mama Adaeze said. Not your father. Your father knew. Your father paid. But it was Chukwu who arranged it. I did not have proof until 10 minutes ago. I do now. She held up the recording device. Unimpressive. 20 years of waiting contained in something the size of a button. Vivian stared at it. Then she looked at the tent. Then she looked at Mama Adaeze and her voice cracked completely open. What do we do? It was not a question about the next 10 minutes. It was not a question about the evidence or the police or the legal proceedings that would now have to come. It was the question of a young woman who had been carrying an impossible weight in silence for 8 months, who had run out of road, who was sitting across from the mother of the man she loved and asking, from the place underneath all the performance and the fear and the careful management of appearances, what do we do now that it is over? What do we do now that the truth is here? Mama Adaeze looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up. She reached up to her headscarf. She removed it. She folded it once and placed it over the arm of the plastic chair. Then she reached up and she removed the pins holding her silver hair flat, and her silver hair fell the way it always did. Fully, completely, the way things look when they stop pretending to be smaller than they are. She looked at the tent. At the photographer near the entrance. At the guests she could see through the open flap, eating, laughing, unaware. At Uncle Chukwu, who had just emerged from the administrative block and was crossing the compound toward the tent, his walking stick hitting the ground in a steady rhythm, his face rearranged into warmth. He saw her standing at the edge of the compound. He registered, without recognition, an old woman who was no longer wearing her headscarf. He looked away. Then something made him look back. He looked at her hair. At her posture. At the way she was standing, which was not the way the woman by the gate had been standing. He looked at her eyes. And Mama Adaeze watched the moment he understood cross his face like a shadow crossing the sun. Complete. Leaving everything different on the other side. She held his gaze across the compound. She did not look away. She let him see her completely. Then she turned to Vivian, who had risen from the chair and was standing beside her, and she said in a voice that was quiet and absolute and had not one tremor of uncertainty in it, "It is time to go inside." There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when the truth walks in. Not the silence of emptiness. The silence of everything that has been loud for too long suddenly understanding that its time is finished. That the performance is over. That the lights have come up and the stage is bare and everyone in the audience can see exactly what was always there underneath the costumes and the careful arrangement of words. Mama Adaeze had waited 20 years for that silence. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a wedding tent decorated with white flowers and golden ribbon, in front of 240 guests who had come expecting a celebration and were about to receive something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. She walked through the main entrance of the tent with Vivian beside her. Not behind her. Beside her. Two women entering together, which was not what anyone in that room was expecting, least of all the people who knew them. The murmuring started before they reached the center aisle. Guests near the entrance turned and looked and turned to look at each other and turned back. The photographer, positioned near the front for the cake cutting, lowered his camera slowly. One of the bridesmaids made a sound that was not quite a word. The pastor, who had been speaking into his microphone about the blessing of gathered community, lost his sentence and did not find it again. Emeka saw his mother first. He was standing at the front beside the wedding table, his hand resting on the back of Vivian's empty chair, a small frown already forming because Vivian had been gone longer than expected and he had been covering the absence with conversation he was not fully present in. He looked toward the entrance because everyone else was looking toward the entrance. And he saw an old woman in a worn wrapper walking down the center aisle of his wedding tent. He looked away. Then he looked back. The walk. The posture. The particular angle of the chin. The silver hair. The silver hair. Emeka's face moved through 5 different expressions in 4 seconds. Confusion. Recognition. Disbelief. Something that cracked open underneath disbelief. And then, underneath all of it, the expression that Mama Adaeze had been holding herself together to reach, the face of her son, her child, the boy who had grown up beside her grief and carried questions he was too kind to ask out loud, looking at her and beginning to understand that something enormous was about to be answered. She walked to the front of the tent. She did not rush. She had waited 20 years. She could walk at whatever pace she chose. She stopped in the center, facing the gathered guests, her son to her left, his bride standing now at her right shoulder, 240 people in a silence that had weight and texture and breath. She spoke clearly enough for the microphone nearest her to catch it without her having to reach for it. "My name is Adaeze Okonkwo. I am the mother of the groom. And I owe every person in this tent an explanation, beginning with my son." Emeka took 1 step toward her. "Mama." She held up one hand gently. Not to stop him. To ask him for 1 more minute of the patience she had always admired in him. He stopped. He stayed. "I came to this wedding this morning disguised as a beggar." She let that land. "Not to test anyone's kindness. Not to embarrass anyone. I came because 3 months ago I received a letter telling me that someone at this wedding knew the truth about how your father died. And I needed to be in a place where no one would watch me carefully. Because the invisible ones always see the most. The tent was so quiet she could hear the generator outside. Your father did not die in a car accident. Emeka's hand came up and pressed flat against his own chest, the automatic gesture of someone absorbing a blow. He was killed. Because he found evidence that the foundation he built, the foundation you have given your career to protecting, was being used to move stolen money. Infrastructure funds. Hospital budgets. Money meant for children in villages who had no other option. He compiled that evidence. He told me he was going to the authorities. And 3 weeks later he was gone. She reached into the hidden pocket of her bag. She placed the yellowed envelope on the table beside the wedding cake. Then she placed the recording device beside it. I have his original evidence. I have had it for 20 years, waiting for the moment I could take it somewhere safe. And this morning, inside this compound, I recorded a phone call that names the person who arranged your father's death. The tent erupted. Not into shouting. Into that particular collective sound of 200 people all moving and breathing and whispering at once, the sound of a room reorganizing its understanding of everything it thought it knew. Mama Adaeze did not raise her voice. His name is Chukwu Okonkwo. She turned and looked at the front row. At the empty seat. At the walking stick resting against the chair that its owner had not returned to. Uncle Chukwu was not in the tent. She had expected this. She had made a phone call of her own while crossing the compound, a call to Emeka, who had made 2 further calls, one to the family lawyer and one to a contact Mama Adaeze had cultivated carefully over 15 years for exactly this purpose. A senior officer who owed her a debt of the kind that is paid not in money but in moments. He will not get far, she said simply. I have made the necessary calls. She turned to Emeka. His face was a landscape she had never seen before, entirely unfamiliar and completely recognizable, the way a place you have only ever seen in photographs looks when you finally stand in it. Everything you expected and nothing you were ready for. I am sorry, she said to him. I am sorry I carried this alone for so long. I told myself I was protecting you. And I was. But I was also afraid. Afraid that if I spoke before I had something solid enough to hold, they would bury it again. Afraid that my voice alone would not be enough. She paused. Your father's voice alone was not enough. I needed more than a grieving wife's word. Emeka crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and his arms came around her and she closed her eyes and held her son in the middle of his own wedding tent and felt 20 years of held breath finally begin to move. They stayed like that for a moment that the photographer later said he almost did not photograph because it felt too private. He photographed it anyway. It became the image that everyone shared. A woman in a worn wrapper and silver hair being held by a man in a navy suit, his face pressed into her shoulder, her hand flat against the back of his head the way hands hold the heads of people they have been terrified of losing. Then Emeka straightened. He turned to Vivian. And this was the moment Mama Adaeze had not scripted, had not planned, had not been certain of until she sat at the plastic table in the compound and watched grief move through a young woman's eyes like weather. Vivian did not look like the bride who had ordered an old woman removed from the entrance that morning. She looked like someone who had been holding a door shut with both hands for 8 months and had just been told she could let go. She looked at Emeka and she told him everything. Not the way Mama Adaeze had told the tent. Measured, prepared, strategic. Vivian told him the way people tell truth when they have run out of the energy required to manage it. Broken sentences. Wrong order. Circling back to correct herself. Her voice cracking in 3 separate places and not recovering cleanly any of the 3 times. She told him about finding her father's letters. About the correspondence with Chukwu. About the name of the man they had paid. About the 8 months of knowing and not knowing what to do with knowing. About entering his life with one intention and staying for a completely different reason. About loving him, which she said last, and which cost her the most. She told him that she had spent the last 3 months trying to find a way to warn him without destroying everything, and that she had failed to find it, and that she was sorry, and that she understood if the word sorry meant nothing from her, and that she was not asking for anything except the chance to say it. Emeka listened to all of it without interrupting. This was his nature. He had always been able to hold space for difficult things without rushing toward resolution. It was the quality in him that Mama Adaeze had always considered his most valuable inheritance, not from her, but from Chitty, who had listened the same way. When Vivian finished, the tent was very still. Emeka turned to his mother. Then he turned back to Vivian. Then he looked at the floor for a long moment, his hands loose at his sides, his jaw working slightly. Then he looked up. "You knew for 8 months," he said. "You came into this marriage knowing." Vivian held his gaze. She did not flinch from it. She had done enough flinching. "I know that is not something you can simply accept. I know you need time. I know what I did at the beginning was wrong regardless of what it became. I am not standing here asking you to forgive it. I am standing here because you deserve the full truth, and I am done being the person who decided what you were allowed to know about your own life." Emeka looked at her for a long time. The guests were so quiet that the sound of distant traffic outside the venue became briefly audible. Then Emeka did something that nobody in that tent expected. He laughed. It was short, and it was painful, and it was entirely his, the laugh that started before it was finished, the laugh that was his father's laugh in his father's rhythm, coming up through him even in this moment because it was simply the way he was made. He pressed his hand over his eyes. He breathed. Then he lowered his hand and looked at Vivian. "I need time," he said. "I need a significant amount of time." "I know," she said. "And I need to know everything. Not the version that protects your father or protects you. Everything." "Everything," she agreed. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the 240 guests, the cake, the flowers, the golden ribbon, the photographer who had lowered his camera again out of something that had finally become real respect for the weight of the room. "I think," Emeka said carefully, "that we will not be cutting this cake today." A sound moved through the tent. Not laughter. Something more complicated. The sound of people who had come for one kind of occasion and were leaving having witnessed something they could not name but would not forget. Mama Adaeze stood in the center of it all and watched her son handle the ruin of his wedding day with a grace that made her press her hand against her chest to keep herself from coming apart entirely. He spoke to the guests briefly, thanking them for coming, asking for their understanding, his voice steady even though his eyes were not. He spoke to the pastor. He spoke to the wedding coordinator. He did all of it with the quiet, purposeful dignity of a man who had grown up beside grief and learned from it what mattered and what did not. The guests began to leave in a way that felt different from the usual end of a celebration. Quieter. More deliberate. Many of them stopped to embrace Emeka on the way out. Several of them stopped to look at Mama Adaeze. Really look, the way people look when they are revising their understanding of someone, and say nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. Vivian's parents arrived at the tent as the guests were leaving. Her father, Chief Okafor, walked in with the posture of a man who had seen the news traveling toward him and had not been able to outrun it. He looked at Mama Adaeze and she looked back at him, and the conversation that passed between them in that look lasted less than 3 seconds and covered 20 years. He looked away first. Whatever comes next for Chief Okafor, Mama Adaeze thought, will come through the proper channels. She had the evidence. She had the recording. She had a lawyer already on his way to the venue and a senior officer who owed her a debt. She had spent 20 years building exactly the kind of careful, irrefutable case that could not be buried in 11 days. Chukwu Okonkwo was apprehended at the eastern gate of the venue 40 minutes later. He had not gotten far. He had underestimated, as people always underestimated, the reach of a woman they had written off as a grieving wife who had accepted an accident. He had made that mistake for 20 years. He would not make it again. When the tent was nearly empty, Emeka came and stood beside his mother. They stood together looking at the flowers and the golden ribbon and the untouched cake and the chairs that still held the shapes of people who had been sitting in them an hour ago. "You knew it was him," Emeka said. "Uncle Chukwu." "I suspected for a long time," she said. "I was certain this morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming as?" He gestured at her wrapper. "Because I needed to see clearly," she said. "And I have found, over many years, that the most dangerous thing you can do in a room full of powerful people is make them believe you are nobody. They stop performing. They stop managing. They say things out loud that they would never say if they knew you were listening." Emeka looked at her sideways. He had his father's way of looking at her sideways when he was absorbing something he found both entirely surprising and completely consistent with everything he had always known. "You have been doing this for 20 years, he said. Looking. Waiting. Alone." The word landed between them softly. "I thought I was protecting you," she said. He turned to face her. "Mama." He said it the way he had said it when he was small, when the warmth was still uncomplicated, before the distance that growing up sometimes carves between parents and children. Before London and the polished accent and the years of her sitting in Chitty's chair at night thinking about all the ways she had loved him from a careful distance, trying to keep him safe from something she could not name to anyone. "You could have told me," he said. "I would have stood beside you." She looked at her son. His father's forehead. His father's laugh. Her eyes, though he did not know that. The particular combination of two people who had loved each other in a specific and irreplaceable way, walking around in the world in the form of this man who had spent his career protecting a foundation built on ground that had been poisoned beneath him without his knowledge. "I know," she said. "That is my regret. Not the waiting. The alone." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it exactly the amount that 20 years of held posture allowed her to lean, which was more than she had leaned into anything in a very long time. Outside the tent, the afternoon was moving toward evening. The light had gone golden and long, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being remembered rather than experienced. The catering staff were beginning to pack up. The flowers would be taken down tomorrow. The golden ribbon would come off the poles. "What happens now?" Emeka said. "With Vivian?" Mama Adaeze considered the question. She thought about a young woman sitting across a plastic table with grief moving through her eyes like weather. She thought about 8 months of impossible knowledge carried in silence. She thought about the difference between a person who does wrong and a person who is placed inside a wrong too large for them to simply step out of. She thought about what it meant to love someone before you understood the full cost of that love. "That," she said carefully, "is between you and her. What I will tell you is this. The woman who humiliated me at the gate this morning was performing cruelty for an audience. But the woman who sat across from me at that table was telling the truth in the only direction she had left. Which one is real, and whether real is enough, that is not mine to decide." Emeka nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She told me she fell in love with me before she knew my last name." Mama Adaeze said nothing. "Do you believe that is possible?" he said. "To love something true inside something built on a lie." She thought about Chitty. About the foundation he had built on the belief that people could be trusted, on the belief that the people closest to him shared his values, on the belief that love was enough to build something permanent on. She thought about how wrong he had been about the people around him and how completely, unwaveringly right he had been about everything that actually mattered. She said, "I believe that is possible. I have seen it." Emeka looked at the untouched cake. Then he looked at the entrance of the tent. Then he looked at his mother. "I have some calls to make," he said. She nodded. "And a great deal of thinking." She nodded again. He kissed her forehead. Then he walked toward the entrance, pulling his phone from his pocket, already beginning the long process of dismantling and rebuilding that the next months of his life would require. Mama Adaeze stood alone in the tent. Around her, the chairs, the flowers, the golden ribbon going slightly soft in the evening air. She reached into the hidden pocket of her bag. She took out the yellowed envelope. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, not physical weight, but the weight of 20 years, of Chitty's hand pressing it into hers, of his voice saying keep it somewhere safe, of all the mornings she had looked at that locked cabinet and asked herself if today was the day and decided it was not yet. Today had been the day. She placed it carefully back inside the pocket. It would go to the lawyer tonight, and from the lawyer to the proper authorities, and from there it would do what Chitty had always intended it to do, what he had died trying to make it do, what the truth always eventually does when someone is patient enough and stubborn enough and loves someone enough to keep carrying it until the right moment arrives. She picked up her bag. She straightened her wrapper. She looked around the tent one more time, at the space where 240 people had been sitting, at the space where her son had stood, at the space where a young woman had finally put down a weight she had been carrying alone. She walked toward the entrance. At the threshold she paused. She looked back at the tin she had left near the pillar where she had been sitting, the small tin that had been part of her disguise, that had sat in the dust all morning catching coins from people who had not looked closely enough to see what was sitting behind it. She left it where it was. Not because she had forgotten it, but because she wanted it there. She wanted some record, however small, that she had sat in that place on that day. That she had been present and patient and invisible and watching. That 20 years of carrying something alone had ended not with collapse but with clarity. That a woman who everyone in that room had dismissed as nobody had walked out of the dust and into the center of her own story and refused, at the last, to be moved. The evening air outside was warm and smelled of jasmine from the venue garden and distant cooking fires from the road beyond the walls. Her car was waiting. Nneka was at the wheel, as she always was, having arrived the moment Mama Adaeze's first call came through, no questions asked, everything handled. Mama Adaeze got in. She sat back. She closed her eyes. "Well," said Nneka without turning around. "How did it go?" Mama Adaeze was quiet for a moment. "It went," she said, "exactly the way the truth goes when you give it enough time. Slowly. And then all at once." Nneka nodded once. Then she put the car in drive and pulled away from the venue slowly, the way you pull away from places that have taken something from you and given something back, and the evening closed over the road behind them, golden and long and full of everything that was finished and everything that was only now, after 20 years, finally beginning.